Hello, everybody, and hopefully welcome back to another episode of Mondays with Mundy. That's me, Jim Mundy, the historian for the Union League Legacy Foundation at the Union League of Philadelphia at broad and handsome streets in beautiful Center City, Philadelphia, which it is. It's a beautiful center city. Last week's episode was about an event that took place in June of 1864, the Great Central Fair. This week's episode is going to start with an episode that took place in June of 1865, something called, has now become known as Juneteenth, because it was on June the 19th of 1865 in Galveston, Texas, that Union General Gordon Granger informed the slaves in Galveston that the Emancipation Proclamation had been signed by Abraham Lincoln on January the 1st, and that they had been free ever since then. But as you can imagine, slave owners and Southern sympathizers weren't exactly in a hurry to tell the slaves that they were indeed freed at all. By then, Texas had approximately 250,000 slaves, many of whom were brought to Texas over the course of the Civil War by planters and slave owners to escape the encroaching Union Army, because once Confederate territory was occupied by the Union Army, the slaves were freed, and of course reinforced by the Emancipation Proclamation. So these slaves didn't know it. And so June 19th became, if you will, the most important day in African-American history, in the sense that it was finally the day when the last slaves understood and knew that they were now free. So emancipation is an important concept during the Civil War. And it should be no surprise that the very first painting in the Union League's collection, the one commissioned by the League and its members in early 1863, was a portrait of Abraham Lincoln having just signed the Emancipation Proclamation, right? The war is now about ending slavery, and Lincoln is now the great emancipator. That's the message. There's a new day in American history because Abraham Lincoln signed that document. Right? In early 1864 in Philadelphia, as Republicans were getting ready to prepare for the election that November, one of the League's two co-founders, George Boker, who was a man of letters and literature, who was a poet, sonneteer, author, playwright, wrote a pamphlet that was published by the Union League's Board of Publication called The Will of the People. And the message is that Lincoln signed that Emancipation Proclamation freeing the slaves because it was indeed by then the will of the people themselves. This is what they wanted. And that Lincoln listened to the people. And that was what they wanted, right? Emancipation would take place in many different forms throughout the city of Philadelphia with the involvement of the League and its members. For instance, January the 10th of 1865, a letter was circulated throughout the city signed by 5 men, 3 of whom were League members, Benjamin Hunt, James Miller McKim, and Morton McMichael, who would become the city's first post-Civil War mayor of Philadelphia. But this letter called for the integration of the Philadelphia streetcar system, because at that point in time it was segregated. And their point is that anybody, regardless of race, should be able to ride a streetcar in Philadelphia. Right? And McMichael was one of the most public figures in Philadelphia, as he was the editor of the newspaper called the North American, which today is the Philadelphia Inquirer of all things. So McMichael, when he ran for mayor in 1866, ran on the platform of integrating the streetcar systems. All right, so the League members were very much involved in the issues of emancipation. Even before then, let's see, there were a number of abolitionists, civil rights advocates in Philadelphia who were League members going back into the 1850s and 40s and earlier. James Miller McKim, who became an abolitionist after reading and meeting George Lloyd Garrison and reading The Liberator, became a proponent of abolitionism when it was incredibly unfashionable for anybody else was doing it. And McKim was such an ardent abolitionist that he had an important figure in American history at this point, that McKim and his wife escorted the widow of John Brown to Harper's Ferry, West Virginia, actually before he was actually hung, and then of course escorted her and the body back to what we think of as North Elba or Lake Placid after he had been hung himself. And McKim was very much an active member of the League, and you can see the level of his engagement before the war and even during the war. It was just remarkable what he was doing. Matthias Baldwin, Baldwin Locomotives, at that point, one of the largest locomotive manufacturers in the country, eventually the world. Baldwin was an early proponent of abolitionism and civil rights for blacks. He integrated the Baldwin workforce He raised money for civil rights activities. He founded a school for young Black children in Philadelphia. One of the great advocates for civil rights in Philadelphia. And although he would die in 1866, so he wouldn't live to see really the fruits of his labor and many others, if you will. But Abraham Barker, another founding member of the League, as was Baldwin. Barker created what we think of today as the first kind of like the Dow Jones of its day, the first paper-produced daily reporting for the stock market. Barker himself personally raised the money to support 5 African-American regiments being raised in Philadelphia during the Civil War itself through that supervisory committee we mentioned earlier. Charles Gibbons, who was the founder of the Republican Party in 1854 in Philadelphia, was a staunch abolitionist from the very, very beginning. Let's see, after Charles Gibbons, we could go on. Who have I got? Thomas Webster, who I mentioned earlier, was the first chairman of the Supervisory Committee for Peninsula Colored Troops. So again, you can see how this list of the activities of the League and its members were absolutely geared towards civil rights and emancipation. And one of my favorite examples is what was known as the Port Royal Society. Port Royal was the first area along the sea coast, the southeastern sea coast of South Carolina and northeastern Georgia, where they call them the Sea Islands are located, the Port Royal area itself. And these islands were liberated by the Union Navy and the Union Army at the very beginning of the war. And there were approximately 15,000 freed slaves now who needed food, clothing, shelter, medicine and healthcare, education, right? Jobs, all right? And so this society was organized to provide all these services for these folks, which they did. And eventually, though, as the need for these services expanded beyond Port Royal itself, as more and more slaves were freed or liberated through the movements of the Union Army and then the Emancipation Proclamation, this organization, known as the Pennsylvania Society, the Pennsylvania Freedmen's Relief Association, and all 4 of its officers were Union League members, right? And its chairman, Stephen Caldwell, was the great, an iron master, as you would have called him back then. Benjamin Hunt, we've already mentioned before, Ellis Yarnall, lawyer, old Quaker Philadelphia family, and James Miller McKim. So almost everything that happened in Philadelphia during the Civil War itself, and even afterwards, and it had to do with emancipation, civil rights, all these important issues in the Civil War, somehow led to the Union League, much the way that all roads led to Rome. All of those roads led to the Union League, either through the institution itself or through the members themselves. So when we hear about June 19th in the news and things like that, take a little bit of time to understand what it was about. Take a little bit of time to dig a little deeper into Philadelphia Civil War history, and hopefully you'll come away with a better understanding of why emancipation itself was so important and vital in this time period. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode. It's one that one can talk about for hours and hours and hours, but you don't want to hear me do that. So I will wish you all a good day. I want to thank you all for being part of this series. We appreciate your support and your enthusiasm for it. And thanks to the Union League Legacy Foundation, most of all, because otherwise we wouldn't be here. So hopefully I will see you all next week. And in the meantime, stay well, take care, and stay healthy. Goodbye now.